edition of Immediate Immersion Live. This one I'm quite excited about because I get a lot of questions about how do you deal with skeptics? How do you get your department on board, or your department chair on board, or your principal on board, or your parents on board, or your students on board? All those questions, we're going to try to address them today. If you have any questions, always please put them in the chat, or if you're watching this on the replay, go ahead and put that in the comment section. I do go and back and read through them so that you can, sorry, my shirt was bothering me there. I'll go back and read through those and answer any questions that I may have. If you have any ideas of yourself, also please share with us either in the comments or in the chat. We're here to learn from each other. So today we're going to be talking about skeptics with CI. And for those who don't know, my name is Scott Benedict, and you're watching Immediate Immersion Live, where we're all about comprehension-based instruction in the modern language classroom. And we'll be right back. And we're back. Hello, welcome again, everybody. Today we have an exciting topic. We're going to be talking about CI skeptics. And I know there's a lot of them out there. Things are starting to change. When I started 20-some years ago, I started in 2001 teaching with CI. It was a minority of us who were doing it. The AP exams were still based on grammar. They are no longer done that way. And it took a while for us to start to make the turn around into more people understanding and going with the comprehensible input method. And when ACTFL started to go into that way too and start rewriting some of their prescriptions saying that we should focus more on meaning than form, again, a little bit of the tide changed a little bit. So here, at least most language teachers, not all language teachers, are familiar at least with the idea of comprehensible input. Sorry, my dog is going crazy, probably because I shut my door and locked him out. But we're getting more people that are actually dipping their toes in and trying comprehensible input, and at least are interested in it. So let's talk about trying to convert more people. And I don't use that word lightly. I know converting sounds like in a negative tone, but the whole idea of comprehensible input is what is the best instruction for our students. So we want to convert people to comprehensible input, not because what they're doing is wrong, but it may not be the best thing for students if the goal is to actually acquire a second language. And so that's why we would like to get more people on board. Now, I am not a research person. If someone tells me something and they're credible, I tend to believe it. I'm not gullible, but I tend to believe it. I don't need to see all the data and the boring research for me. Research can be very boring to me. However, still there. It's bothering me. Caught over there. Sorry. Driving me crazy. However, there is tons of research out there that proves that comprehensible input is better at getting students towards fluency than any other methodology. And it all started with Stephen Krashen when he was studying English as a second language, and he came up with a theory of comprehensible input and all the 5 theories that go along with that. And the whole idea is the more we hear the language, the more we read the language, the better we can speak and write the language. And you don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to be a researcher. You don't even have to be a teacher to understand that's how we learned our first language. For the first 2 years, or roughly 16 to 24 months, all we did was listen. Our parents may have read books to us, but we certainly weren't reading at that time. And we probably weren't talking until the latter part of that. And if what we were saying was grammatically incorrect, and usually single words are really, really short phrases. But for that time, that 2-year time, all we are doing is listening. We are getting comprehensible input. And that started to allow for a small trickle of language to come out. And as our world expanded, we had more listening comprehension, and we had more reading comprehension because our parents were reading to us more and we were starting to read ourselves. That's how we got our first language. And then there's been lots of researchers since, but the main one lately has been Bill Van Patten, and he talks a lot about comprehensible input and why it's important and why that's how we learn languages. But one of the things that he talks about is that it doesn't matter if it's your first language, your second language, or your upteenth language, we acquire the language in the same way. And it doesn't matter if it's your second language or it's your native language. Those two things are acquired the same way. So for example, I teach Spanish. I am not a native speaker of Spanish, but I went through the exact same steps that a native Spanish speaker goes through when I'm learning a second language. Now, the length of time that each stage is played, Bill Van Patten says that depends on what your native language is. For example, English does not have gender, does not have verb endings, so those stages take a little bit longer for English speakers to get. But French speakers would speed right through those phases, even though they went through the same phases as a native Spanish speaker, because they have those concepts already in their language. It's not something they have to train their brain in. So that's comprehensible input. If you want to get the research, those are the two people that I highly recommend, Stephen Krashen and Bill Van Patten, to get some good ideas. And a book I like to recommend is called While We're on the Topic. Let me put that here in the chat. While We're on the Topic. This is by Bill Van Patten, and it delves a little bit into research, but in a really easy way. So it's more of a lighter take on it. It does give you the research, but it does talk about all the concepts that Bill Van Patten is talking about, and it's not dry, and that's what I like about that book. So it's been published for an actful for a few years now, but I highly recommend that book if you can get a hold of it. So let's first talk about why the skepticism. So let me come at it first of all from an experienced teacher. Let's say they have been teaching for 20-some, 30-some years. And back when they went to school, comprehensible input wasn't really talked about. It wasn't talked about as a method of teaching second language. And so they have spent the last 20 or 30 years teaching with usually the standard, at least in America, is the grammar translation method, which is how most textbooks, what they use. They teach vocabulary and they teach grammar rules. And then they drill those things, and then they hope that they come together into fluent sentences and fluent speech. But come from their aspect. They've been doing this for 20 or 30 years, and you're coming at it saying comprehensible input is not only better, but grammar translation hasn't worked by evidence of American schools and how many bilingual students we turn out. So you're telling them that what they have dedicated their lives to for the last 20 or 30 years has been wrong, and they haven't been doing their job to the best of their ability. And how do you think that would make somebody feel? That you're telling them that they actually have not helped any of their students along the way. And that would just be false. Obviously, there are kids who can learn that way. It may not be the best way, but Maya Angelou says, do your best until you do your best until you know better, and when you know better, do better. So we've got to come at it from a different angle, because you don't want to say that the last 10, 20, or 30 years of their career has been for naught, and now they are like in this really dilemma. So we don't want to come across that way. We've got to talk about, you know what? This new way has come along. We are getting these results. And so why don't we try and experiment along the way and see what we can do? Because we don't want to say that everything that they've done so far has been a failure. It's just something new that's come along. They didn't know about it, and let's try something new. We want our students to be lifelong learners, and we need to exemplify that in our classrooms as well. And again, a lot of teachers, it's getting harder now, but there are still a lot of teachers who are unfamiliar with comprehensible input. We hired a new teacher this year. He's a brand new teacher, as his second career, and he was not familiar with the idea of comprehensible input. It's not getting out to teacher schools everywhere across the nation or even the world. And then the third reason might be that they don't really understand how languages are acquired. They know how languages are taught, but they don't know how languages are acquired. And people say, you know, I can't learn a language, and that's true. If you follow Stephen Krashen, he talks about the difference between learning and acquisition. And no human on this planet has learned a language. Just like you can't learn to drive a car by memorizing all the car parts and how to put a car back together. You actually need to drive the car, and it's the same thing with a language. But everybody can acquire a language. Even special needs students have acquired a language. Usually their first one, unless there's some really traumatic brain injury that doesn't allow them speech. And even if they can't verbalize, they can understand the speech. So everybody can acquire a language. It has nothing to do with brain power. It's something that's inherently native to human beings. And parents are experts at teaching languages because there is not a parent around who has not been able to teach their child language. It doesn't happen. How many teenagers do you know who cannot speak because their parents didn't do a very well job at teaching? So that lack of understanding of how languages are acquired is also something. It's not something that was taught to me in school. It's something that I found out after I left school and I learned about secondary. So those are the kinds of things that cause the skepticism. And so we need to take it back. If we're going to address that, we need to figure out what are their objections to comprehensible input, figure out what those objectives are, and come up with some counterpoints. And best of all, this is how I've always found it works best, because nobody likes to be told that they're wrong. You've been doing it wrong all these years. And nobody wants something forced down their throats. And nobody wants a zealot either that's always selling them on something new. So the best way that I have found to get people to see what I'm doing is to show them results. So I will show them my students' quick writes and what my students can do. Not to show them what their students can't do, but just show them what my students can do. And then they're going to ask the question, so how did you get them to do that? And then I can lead into what we're doing. James says, I have been studying using Orton Gillingham to help special needs students with second language. I'm not familiar with him. I'll have to look him up. Specifically phonetics. Yes, I did have one special needs kid years ago. Where he was in special needs, he had a 504. He had a problem with phonemes. And he was a native speaker of Spanish, and I was teaching him, as a native speaker of Spanish in a heritage speaker class. And I was told I cannot teach him the Spanish phonemes. He had such a hard time with the English ones. They didn't want him to be confused with them at all. So he would write the way that it sounded in his head, which was illegible. I couldn't understand a word that he was saying or writing said. He spoke fine, but the writing was the problem. So I used to he would write it out, and then I would have him read it out loud to me. and I would grade it as writing. But yes, I'll have to look that one up. I'm not familiar with that. I have had a lot of luck with special needs students. They usually end up putting those kids in my classroom because the way we teach with comprehensible input addresses multiple modalities, and that helps every student learn, not just special needs students, but special needs students seem to excel with that. When you're not using a textbook, having them memorize vocabulary and memorize complex grammar rules that don't really make sense, you get a lot more buy-in by them, and they get a lot more success that way. But yes, thank you, James. I will look into that. Orton Gillingham. I'll put that down in my notes. So that's why the skepticism. Show them the results, the successes that you're having without being boastful or, what's the word I'm looking for? Without being, I can't think of the word. Hakdarse. What does that mean in English? I can't think of the word that I'm looking for. But without being pushy about it, without, showing so much pride that, look at my students, look what they can do. Your students can't do this, not that kind of thing. But just when you have your PLCs and you're talking about assessments, show examples of what your students can do in a non-threatening way. Next, let me switch my thing here. There we go. Education is key. So we need to bridge the education, the knowledge gap. Stakeholders like parents and administrators may not be familiar with the underlying theories and research that support CI. So that's that information. Maybe do a book study with your teammates about, like the good example would be While We're on the Topic by Bill Van Patten. It's a great book. It's a light read. It's not full of all kinds of dry research. It's not a thick, huge book, which some linguistic books can be. So you might do a book study with that. You might, when you go to back to school night and you're doing that, you might talk to parents about the science of acquiring a language. I've never had a problem with parents understanding the way that I teach or thinking that it's a good or a bad way. They understand it. They get it right away because most of them took multiple years of language in school and they did not learn the language. They can't use it to this day. So they get it. I usually don't have problems with that. Administrators sometimes have issues with it, especially if they're not a language teacher. And most administrators are not language teachers, have not been language teachers. Many of them don't know a second language. So you may have to get them on board. I know TPRS books, when they do trainings, they have special discounts for administrators to participate in the training. We took them to the national conference. Our administrator a couple years ago, it's now been a while ago because the administrator has moved on to the district level, but he came for, I think 2 years in a row. He came and he learned Russian with Katya, and he went to the workshops and learned the way that we're teaching and why it's important and why it works, and experienced it for himself because he failed Spanish in high school, but he was acquiring Russian with Katya. And, objectively, Russian is much more difficult to acquire than Spanish would be. So education is that key. Give them little snippets. If you send out weekly emails to parents, add in a couple of snippets out there if you don't have your parents on board. As I said, if you're doing PLCs, have a book study. Have a just some YouTube videos. Couldn't think of what I was trying to say. YouTube videos that may talk about this. There are lots of them out there about people who are learning languages who aren't necessarily teachers, but they talk about comprehensible input and how it's helped them. And there is a book. Let me see. I've got to search it up here. Bear with me a second. Let's see. Amazon. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it right away. It's got a weird name. Let's see. Oh, I found it. Okay, so it's called... Ooh, and it is back available. It was not available for a long time. Entertaining an Elephant, a novel about learning and letting go. Let me put the link in Amazon. I have no affiliation. I'm just sharing the link with everybody. There's the link. It's a great book. It was one I read in my methods class, and in my school we didn't have a language methods class. It was just everybody who wasn't math, science, English, or social studies was in this methods class. So it could have been art teachers with PE teachers. All of that was in there. But we read this book, and I didn't know about TPRS or comprehensible input at the time, but this book was a really eye-opener after the fact, because it's about an English teacher who kids don't like. He laminates his lesson plans, not by date, but by he knows exactly what he's doing on the 4th day of school, the 6th day of school, the 10th day of school, because his lesson plans, he's been using them for decades. They're the same ones. He's laminated them. They're in a book, and he just knows to turn. It's the 15th day of school. Let me just flip over to 15 day, and this is what I'm doing. He was really big on grammar and drills and all of that stuff, but he was not connecting with his students at all. And through a custodian who would put up these little quotes up on the board every day, and the kids thought it was the teacher putting them up there, he learned to relate better with his students and find a better way of instruction, which is really powerful because it's kind of the same story from going from traditional language teaching to comprehension-based teaching. So if you don't do like a book study of while we're on the topic, perhaps you can do a book study of this Entertaining an Elephant novel. It's really good. I highly recommend the novel. It's not that big, but education can help. And looking at different ways of instruction and giving different examples. So it's not always you throwing it down someone's throat. Give some other examples, some other voices in there, YouTube videos, books, bring in other people to talk about it. There's lots of different ways to do it, but you want to provide some sort of education, and not like you're hitting them over the head with it, but that you are slowly bringing them into more knowledge about how things are. Because when they went to school, it may not have been a topic at their school, and they may have a life. So they may have kids at home, a spouse at home, pets at home. They don't go and do a whole bunch of workshops and trainings to better what they're doing, because right now they're just staying where they are because they have so much that they're trying to manage between home and work life. So you can help them by giving them small little nuggets of that. You can also, if it's whoever's involved, you can invite your administrator to watch your class and see how the kids are working in there. Always, by showing what your kids can do is always helpful, no matter whether it's parents or administrators or fellow teachers. When they can see what kids can do, it's really amazing. Back in my early years, before I was implementing what was called TPRS back then, I was at a workshop, and this lady brought in her class, and it was a level 1 class, and they were doing this one activity, inside circle and outside circle. They were reading this novel called Pobriana, which I had not heard of at this time. And there's an argument that goes on in that book at the beginning about Pobriana wants to go on a student exchange to Mexico, but they come from a poor family, and so the dad is saying, but we can't afford it, but we can't afford it. But she's saying, but it's free, but it's free. She was going to get a scholarship to go. The school was going to pay. So they did this inner-outer circle in level 1 where they argued each point. One circle was the father, and the other one was Anna, and they went back and forth. And I was just amazed at what they could do. And this was like in the fall of level 1. And obviously it wasn't, anything elaborate that they were saying. it was short phrases, but that they were communicating that much in such a little bit of time, that stuck to me. So I wanted to learn what she was doing in her classroom so that I could get similar results. Next, let's go ahead and talk all about the data. So we all know administrators, departments, districts, schools, they all want the data. Data, 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 data. So metrics matter. And so you can show the effectiveness of comprehensible input through the data. Skeptics often talk about, what proof do you have of the effectiveness? And research isn't enough, because research is at a distance, and usually they go, it doesn't apply to our school, apply to our population, our kids. That was at the college level, that was on the East Coast, that was on the West Coast, that was in the Midwest. They have all kinds of arguments of why it wouldn't work for them. But if you have data with your own students in the school that you're talking about, that can be powerful, especially if you have comparisons to traditional methods. So we in our PLCs, we're always talking about data. When we do an assessment, we compare and talk about the data so that we can find out best practices along the way. And without pointing out any names, if you're the only one using comprehensible input, but you're using standards tests that everybody has to give, you can compare your data with that of a traditional teacher. Now, what I did back when I first started teaching, I was the only one in the school who was doing comprehensible input methods, and we gave the textbook test at the end of each semester. And I had to argue with them to get speaking in, because they said, we don't really work on that, so it shouldn't be important. I'm like, hello, that's our job, is to teach kids to speak the language. But so we had to compromise. We added speaking in, and I had to put grammar, the tricky grammar questions, those multiple choice grammar questions that textbooks give, also in. They didn't tell us how we had to weight them, so I always weighted my grammar section as 1%, just so it showed up on there, but it was not weighted heavily at all. But when I looked at the data, my kids were really strong in the skills, listening, reading, writing, and speaking. And their students also were generally pretty good at reading and listening. But where the differentiator came in was speaking and writing. My kids were doing, not because I'm a marvelous teacher, that's not what I'm saying, but because of the method, they were better writers and speakers than the other students. And then when we looked at the grammar, my kids were no better or no worse than kids who were taught that grammar translation method. They all did poorly on the grammar, because the way those questions are written, they're to trick kids or to look for little minutiae that nobody really cares about, and you don't even have to understand what the question is asking to be able to answer it and get it correct. So show the data without pointing out that, oh, look, this teacher uses this method which doesn't work. Just show the data. Just show the data saying, this data is from traditional teaching methods, this data is from comprehensible input type methods, no names attached, and look at the data and let the data speak for itself. Next, let's talk about real-world testimonials. I had a student once who left my school. They left school and they had moved to a different school, and I got an email from them, and it was a funny little email. It said, so I asked them, how's your Spanish class? And they go, well, in your class, we spoke Spanish with a little bit of English, but this Spanish class is we speak English with a little bit of Spanish. And it was just so funny about that realization. So get those real world testimonials from parents whose kids are successful, from students who are successful. Get them to record a testimonial that says, look, this is awesome. I have learned. I was able to do this. I love hearing the stories from my students who say, I work at the Gap at the mall, and this lady came in, she wanted to buy something, and she didn't speak English. So, but I was able to help her because my little bit of Spanish I know, I was able to communicate with her and she was so happy and so appreciative. Or I went on a cruise ship and I was able to Mexico and I was able to talk with the waiters and I was able to buy things in Spanish. Those are great real world testimonials of what kids can do. So have those, collect those, whether they're written or they're video. Whatever you can get, collect those. Get as many of those as possible. Interview your students at the end of the class and at the end of the year. Ask them how they learn and what they think and get that kind of information. Obviously, not every kid's going to be gung-ho about it, but there are going to be a lot of them who say, you know what? I have learned a lot in this class, or I can speak now where I couldn't before. It's especially useful if those kids came from a traditionally taught classroom. Or vice versa. I have kids who sometimes go from me to a traditionally taught classroom, and we have 4 high schools, and 3 of our high schools teach traditionally, and 1 of them teach with comprehension-based methodologies. So the kids who go to one of those 3 high schools, I'll ask them, after they've taken their first Spanish class there, to compare and contrast and what they liked about each and what they disliked about each, so I can get those testimonials. I also ask parents from their perspective, what do you think about that? Do you think your kids learned any Spanish or language, whatever you're teaching? What do you think helped them? Why do you think it worked? Do you think it would have helped you to do this type of thing? Get those testimonials, because our students and then secondarily our parents are our customers. And we are here for the students. So if they're finding success and parents are talking about that success, then it's very hard for fellow teachers and administrators to negate that. Most administrators, most school boards, most districts bend over backwards to keep their parents happy. And so that's one way to do it. With us, I teach at an IB middle school, and we have 4 middle schools in our school district. And is it 4? Yeah, it is 4. Couldn't think for a minute. 4 middle schools in my district, and we were the only one teaching language. And the parents who wanted their kids to learn language had to then get an intra-district transfer to our school. And then there's no busing for that, so they had to drive them every day. So that could be a 20 or 30-minute drive each way, dropping their kids off and picking them up. So they went to the school board and said, we want language in all of the schools. So the board ended up doing that, giving 1 Spanish teacher per each school, except for ours, because we're an IB school. We're required to teach language. We have 4 language teachers at our school currently. So that's the way real world testimonials really, really help. People can't argue with the people who are actually learning the language, or parents of the ones learning the language. And lastly, addressing logistical concerns. Even if teachers and administrators are convinced that CI is the greatest thing, they may have, problems and concerns with how do we implement this? How do we pay for resources? Teacher training? What about a curriculum? All of these things. Well, first of all, textbooks are expensive. And the great thing about teaching with comprehensible input, you don't have to use textbooks. There are curriculums out there, and those curriculums that are out there are a lot cheaper than textbooks. And I'll tell you, at one of my school districts, many years ago now, because I've been at my current school for 10 years, at this school, we just did the textbook adoption for the district. And they had, it's been 14 years since language. Language is always the last one who gets a new textbook. And they spent like $80,000 on textbooks for our school. Now, it was Nevada, and in Nevada, the law says that every student must have access to a textbook. It doesn't say every student must have a textbook. It says must have access. So we went to our administrator and we said, we're not going to use these books. We can comply with the law because we can keep one class set of each level. So one class set of level 1, one class set of level 2, one class set of level 3 for each of the languages we teach. So we had, just 3 sets of books for Spanish. Level 1, level 2, level 3. So like 40 books of each. So it's 120 books of Spanish. Same thing for French. Same thing with German. And we taught Japanese. So same thing with Japanese. We said, can we return the rest of the books and use that to buy comprehensible novels? And our administrator, who wasn't opposed to getting his hands slapped and really understood the essence of the law, we were complying with the law. Granted, I may have the Spanish 1 books in my room, and Spanish 1 may be taught by 3 teachers, but if a kid wanted the book, he would just come to my room and check out the book. We never would have 40 kids who wanted a book at one time. I don't think in the 7 years I was in that district, I had 1 kid who wanted the book and checked it out. So it wasn't a big deal. He said, yes, but. He said, we'll return all those books, but the money we get back, we split. Half of it goes to you in the language department, and half of you goes back to the school that we can use for whatever we need at school. And we said, not a problem, because $40,000 back in the language department was better than no money in the language department and being stuck with $80,000 worth of textbooks that nobody's going to even open the box for. So we made that agreement. We didn't use all of it for novels. Obviously, it's a lot of money, but we used it for training because anything that was in our world language budget by our district rules had to go back directly to students. So training would count for that. So we used it a lot to send teachers for different trainings, and we also used it for, as I said, comprehensible novels. So textbooks. You can tell them, I understand your concerns with the money, but if we don't buy textbooks, money allocated for those textbooks can be used to purchase curricula, can be used to purchase comprehensible novels, and can be used to purchase teacher training. And it will go much further in that way than it would with textbooks. You can talk also about the teacher training, that it's cheaper to bring a trainer into your school to teach you than it is for teachers to go out for training. And there are online options which are even cheaper. But training is not as big of a deal as people thought. Yes, when you think about sending someone away for training, usually training's at least 3 days. You're talking, it's going to be at least, the course itself, the training is probably going to be $300, $400, $500 plus airfare plus hotel. You're looking at about $1,500 to $2,000 per person to send them. But for that same $2,000, but only once, you can bring someone into your school and teach everybody at the same time. And if that's still not in the budget, you can do a lot of online training, which is still even cheaper. And there's lots of resources with the internet now. There's lots of resources that you can get even for free to get you started on the comprehensible input training. And curriculum development. You can save money by creating your own curriculum as a team rather than purchasing one, though CI curriculum is relatively inexpensive, especially when compared with textbooks. So that's the one thing, the money of it. Another thing is, it's a lot to switch. If you've not been doing this all this time, and you're trying to switch, it's a lot to switch all at once. So one of the best ideas I learned from Susan Gross was teach them one thing to do and have them work on that until they're comfortable with that. And then switch out another thing. So for example, you could start with conversations. So teach everybody how to do true conversations with your students. In TPRS circles, that's called PQA. I don't like jargon that I have to explain what it means. It doesn't make sense. It's basically a conversation with students, just a lot more deeper than going in and just asking every student the same question. So teach that skill. How do we engage kids in conversations? How do we ask questions about kids and get the whole class involved? How do we repeat things and get more details to stay on the topic longer so they have time to acquire the language? Teach that skill, learn that as a team, practice it in class with your students, and then when you get good at that, then add another layer. Now maybe movie talk, because movie talk, I like to call it story asking with training wheels, because you don't have to come up with a story. You've got the story there. You just need to talk about it and ask questions about it, and teach that. And then do reading. And once you've done those three things, then you can go back and take a little bit of the training wheels off and do picture talk, where you still have something there to start a story with, but it's not as detailed as a movie talk would be, before you can teach them how to just story ask all alone. So do it in incremental steps. Do it as a team so that everybody's doing it at the same time and they're learning. And one of the things that we do in our school, and this is not from the administrator, it's what we have opted to do, and we've been doing it since we started our program. This is now our 11th year of our program. We go and observe each other. We make a commitment to observe 2 other teachers once a month. So we're giving up, and we have to be there at least 15 minutes. So we're giving up 15 minutes of our prep time twice a month to go in and observe another teacher and how they're doing. And we leave a little comment card. It asks just a few questions. It asks, how much percentage-wise is this target language being spoken? Our goal is 80% or higher. We really want higher than that, but our expectation when we go in there is 80% or higher. What is the teacher doing to make the language comprehensible? And 3, what is the teacher doing to make the language fun, or reducing that affective filter? Those are the 3 questions we answer on there. We can only write positive comments on there. There's nothing negative. We hand that to the teacher at the end. We drop it on their desk, because usually I go the first few minutes of class. I drop it on their desk. I quietly leave. They can share that with anybody they want or not share it at all. It is completely up to them. It is not something that our administrators use or can use. They know that we do this. They know that we fill out a form. They are not allowed to ask for the form, see the form, or ask about the form, or ask about our observations. It is just for us to learn from each other. Now, if, let's say I got observed by one of my fellow teachers and I liked my comments and I wanted to share that with my administrator, that's my prerogative, but it's not a requirement or an expectation in any way. That allows us to be free and not be stressed about those observations, because it's in a positive, let's learn from each other. And I have learned some great things from other teachers by doing this. One of the things, I used to do weekend talk a lot. I don't do it as much anymore. I swap it out with something else. But I learned from another teacher. She would email her students on Friday and say, take pictures of what you're doing over the weekend, pick one and share it with me. And then I'll pick a few of these and we'll talk about them on Monday during conversation, during our weekend talk. So she would put up a picture of what kid was doing, and then they would ask the kid about their weekend, and they would have this conversation about that. Well, I did the weekend talk, but I never thought about getting a picture from someone for that. So that was something I learned, and I only know that because I observed. Because she never thought to share that in a PLC, because she didn't think it was anything special, or that maybe other people were already doing it. She didn't really think about it. But I had not seen it before, so seeing it really, really helped. So usually, as I said, the 2 big things about the logistics is money, training, and implementation. So for that money, we talked about ways of getting money. You can also look for grants. I have done some workshops where they have paid me out of grant money. They've asked for a grant, and from that grant, they can hire me to come out and do a workshop. So that's one way to do that as well. You might look within your local area. Local businesses may want to donate to the training of the teachers and things like that. Look for different unusual resources. Donors choose. You can put up a budget for training and get donors to contribute to that. Especially there's lots of times corporations will match donations. That's donorschoose.org. I have done that with books. I've not done it with training, but I know districts that have to pay for a workshop and pay for transportation and such like that. I don't think private schools can do it. I think it can only be public schools, but I could be wrong. Go to the website, see what the restrictions and requirements are, and you can follow through with that. But that's an option as well to be able to do. And then that helps the money and the training kind of go hand in hand. And then implementation. Take it step by step. Teach one thing and have them master that one thing before adding the second thing and master that thing. Doing it step by step is a lot easier than trying to implement everything all at once and saying, I'm going to take everything I've been doing and throw it out, and I'm going to do all this new. That's overwhelming for both you and the students. So doing it step by step by step is great for that. So that's all I have for convincing the skeptics in ways that I would do it. I have been fortunate, except for my first 4 years of teaching where I was the only comprehensible input teacher. I have only worked in comprehensible input districts. So the schools I worked at in Las Vegas, there were 2 of them. They were both comprehensible input. We would only hire teachers willing to do that. And in the school that I teach at now, it's the same way. We only hire teachers who do comprehensible input or are willing to get trained and use it. They cannot use traditional methods. So I have been fortunate in that. But in that first 4 years, I was that zealot, and I shouldn't have been. I kind of rubbed people the wrong way because I was such a zealot for this, because I was finding such great success from what I was doing before, and I was so amazed, and I was so young and naive about how to convince people to do things. So don't do what I did back then. Follow these steps. It will help. There's no magic cure. You're not going to, if someone is really stubborn and doesn't want to change, nothing you do is going to make them change. But you can slowly change them around. At one of my schools, we had a French teacher, and she was close to retirement, and she says, I am not doing that. I know the benefits. I'm just not going to change what I'm doing now. I've got like 3 or 4 years left. It's just not worth my time anymore to do all of that. And then after a couple of years, she decided, you know what? I'll just do it my level 1s and I'll phase it in. So my level 1s, then when they become level 2s, I'll do it in level 1 and 2. And then they become level 3s, I'll do it 1, 2, 3, etc. But it didn't work out that way. She did it in level 1, and it went over so well that her levels 2, 3, and 4 at the time said, why aren't we having this much fun in doing that? So she had to convert everything all at once. But she was a skeptic. I had another teacher who I was doing a training in Nashville, Tennessee. And she was an older woman, and she was a native German speaker. She taught German. She was also on her way to retirement pretty soon. She did not like teaching anymore. She did not like the kids she taught. She said teaching had changed in her years, and it was time for her to give it up. She was at this workshop only because her new colleague, a younger teacher, dragged her to it. She was kicking and screaming the whole way. But by the end of the workshop, I had converted her, and she had a new love for teaching, and she taught 3 more years in addition to the ones that she after retirement. So she had planned on retiring in a few years, but she stayed 3 more years afterwards and became an ambassador for comprehensible input in her district. So there are people that can change. Even people who are seasoned teachers can change. Just don't try to shove it down everybody's throats. Now, if anybody has any questions, comments, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the comments if you're watching this on the replay. If you found this helpful, please share, like, and subscribe. It really does help get this video out to more people. Put comments and questions in the section so that other people can see them. If you know about someone this can help, please share the video. And if you aren't already aware, we have our Immediate Immersion Assessment Academy going on right now. If you're interested, you can register at mm.us/academy. It is 10 webinars that delve deep into proficiency-based grading and assessment. We are going to have our 4th class this Sunday. You can watch live or you can watch the replays. Once you purchase, you will have access until the end of 2024. So even the classes we've already had, the first 3, you can still have access to those once you register. But our classes are Sunday mornings at 8 a.m. Pacific and 11 a.m. Eastern. So if it's something you're interested in, whether you're watching live or you're going to watch the recordings, you can go to mm.us/academy to register for that. And with that, I thank you all. I hope you learned something today. I hope I could help you with helping your colleagues with turning over to be comprehensible input teachers. Sorry, I'm looking here to see what we're talking about next week. Next week, we are going to be talking about networking strategies. James says, thank you. Here in Panama is the first time I have gotten pushback on CI methods. There is a school, James, and I don't know it. I apologize. But there is a group of Panamanians that come to the conferences here in the United States every few years that are all about comprehensible input. So I know there's at least a small group there. So I don't know how to contact them. You might go on the Facebook NTPRS/IFLT group. Go there, join that if you're not already a member of that, and ask around, and they'll pop up and they'll tell you who they are. They're a great group of people. They come in, they always do Panamanian dances for us. It's been an awesome experience. I love those folks there. So you might check them. They might be able to help you with that in your area. Maureen says, great help. Thanks. You are so welcome, Maureen. Next week, to kind of go along with this skepticism, we're going to talk about networking, how to network with other comprehensible input teachers. You might be the sole teacher at your school or in your district that does this, or you might be the only teacher at all because you're in a small district or a small town. So we'll find ways to network with each other. So with that, I will say goodbye to everybody. I hope everybody has a wonderful week. And I will see you next week. Same time, same channel, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Have a good night, everybody.